Hello, and welcome to Climate Conversations, a World Weather Network program of online encounters between artists and writers, thinking aloud with scientists and environmentalists. By combining knowledge with imagination, we hope the conversations can promote ideas for change at a time of acute global turbulence, when both weather systems and socio-political systems appear equally unstable. The first of these interdisciplinary dialogues brings together two exceptional minds meeting for the first time: artist Laurie Anderson and anthropologist Anna Tsing. Laurie Anderson's unprecedented body of work includes and often integrates performance, language in all its forms, music, painting, VR and AI, filmmaking and animation. Listening to her 1982 album, Big Science, was, said one commentator at the time, like sitting down with a strange form of life that has been studying us for a long time. A pioneer of the poetic uses of technology, Laurie's recent half-century survey at the Horseshoe Museum in Washington took the form of a series of installations and environments entitled The Weather, a nod to John Cage, who spoke of his collaborations with Merce Cunningham in meteorological terms because he said, like the weather, it's impossible to say when something begins or ends. John Cage, who once foraged fungi for New York's top restaurants, would have loved Anna Tsing's remarkable book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, a parable on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. Anna Tsing is professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the co-editor of Feral Atlas, which Tsing describes as the more than human Anthropocene, reminding us that our lives are dependent on multi-species collaboration. By amassing field reports of precarious feral ecologies alongside the unintentional consequences of imperialism, industrialization, and other ruinous human infrastructures, this online atlas gently maps a means towards collaborative survival. Wonder in the midst of dread is a phrase Anna Tsing has often used to describe the feeling of her work as an anthropologist and ethnographer, and it could equally apply to the storytelling art of Laurie Anderson. Wonder in the midst of dread. So, on behalf of the World Weather Network, I'm delighted to welcome Laurie Anderson and Anna Tsing.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Laurie. It's really a pleasure to work with you today.
We're just meeting, so it's really going to be fun to just see what happens and just kind of wander about and talk about a lot of things.
Yeah, I thought as we got started, the different ways that weather are getting used in this event would be an interesting place to start. I am really enchanted by the World Weather Network and what they're trying to do. I think, we know that the global climate is an abstraction from the weather, and we forget that the weather's important, and the idea of climate, of course, is incredibly important in lots of political and scholarly ways, but it loses the specificity of the weather, all the different kinds of phenomena and affects that come together to make the weather in a particular place. So I was very excited to read reports on the weather in different parts of the world, which is really how I've been understanding, the Anthropocene as a kind of patchy phenomena made up of all of these different kinds of weather.
Yeah.
But that brings, go ahead.
It reminds me of what you were saying in your book about polyphony, because lots of different melodies kind of colliding around. And I love the way that you described that feeling of trying to listen and follow that many stories at once. And I think that seems what this weather station thing is about, kind of.
Right.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a beginning of a way to ask you about your important new show on the weather. Can you tell us about it?
Well, I used the title, The Weather, really just to say that it was going to be about stories, because that's what we talked about when there was nothing else to talk about, or the conversation ground to a halt, and you'd go, so crazy weather we're having. You know, that's what we talked about in the Midwest when we ran out of stuff to say. So the show that I have called The Weather it's this donut shaped museum in Washington. Nation's capital was there during the January 6th event. And, anyway, it is a show about stories and how we tell them and who's telling them. And it's very hard to put a story in a museum and easier to put it in a book or a film. So I struggled with how to put words into things and things into words. That was making that translation. But so that was just a kind of catch-all thing. But there was a lot of things in there about different kinds of installations about, there was one with my collaborator from Guantanamo when we did something called Habeas Corpus, and that was a kind of film sculpture thing. And then there was a piece called Citizens, which is a lot of little sculptures, film sculptures with people sort of kind of sharpening their knives just sitting on the floor. And so I tried to look at some of the political aspects of weather as well, which really struck me in the title of your book, which I love so much, that it was not just announcing itself as being about time, and of course the mushroom at the end of the world, and then on life, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. So many of the things you said about the political situation, the economic one, in terms of storytelling, were just completely mind-boggling. Same with Feral Atlas. Where are you going next? I mean, I know it's maybe too early to talk about the future, but I'm so curious.
Sure. I mean, the weather reports actually is related. I'm, always a person who's liked to tell stories through some kind of encounters with stuff that's going on in the world. That's where my storytelling comes from. And I'm gearing up for new ethnographic research in Indonesia, where I worked before and spent the summer there in Kalimantan and Papua. And the thing about it is it rained every single day, and it was supposed to be the dry season in those places. And the whole seasonality seems to have disappeared. So people would say, I'd say, well, isn't this the dry season? They say, look, it's raining. How could it be the dry season? It's pouring down rain. And in the place in Papua I was, it flooded every day. So it wasn't just rain every day, it flooded every day. And so I want to tell stories about water and concrete and how we have managed to build worlds in which water and concrete don't do very well together, and constantly overflow the boundaries and go into places that they aren't supposed to go. And that water, you can't stop it, so it's going somewhere. And so I'm now trying to be curious about water and concrete and how they work together in this strange world we've made.
Yeah, that we've made it. So it's put so perfectly in your book in so many different ways. Actually, I love that we're sitting under these clouds. This graphic is a kind of, it's like about to pour. And it was just reminding me of what you were saying about, I think someone was asking you, or you brought up like maybe cloud seeding, or maybe it was some kind of intervention thing, weather intervention. And somebody said, well, what do you think about that? And you were like, that terrifies me. And I couldn't agree. People start, just seeding the clouds. The next project I'm doing has is very much about clouds. It is sort of about their history and what they're doing, and it's a kind of like a opera about rescue, but starring clouds. So I really was really loving all of your stories that had to do with these events, especially when you said that you like to listen to stories. I mean, the open ticket world that you described in your book, which was where a place in Oregon that I guess you didn't want to say exactly where it was, they called open ticket, and the characters that were there who were picking the mushrooms. I was very interested in the connection that you made with their war experiences, because you are presenting these blasted landscapes, which are like from some Beckett play, that are like, whoa, the little scrawny pine trees and all the mushrooms peeking up under rocks, and what really struck me was you were talking about in a way about trauma, and that some of those pickers were Vietnam guys, and others had war experiences, and it just was reminding me of so many of the camps around the United States now, especially in LA, where a lot of the Vietnam vets are camped in front of the Veterans Association, not to mention the other camps all over the place. And the camp that you described, could you tell us a little bit about that association that you made with their experience, and then getting together to pick mushrooms, and because that was really striking to me.
So yes, this is about these mushroom pickers who come together every autumn to pick a valuable mushroom for the Japanese market in particular, and a lot of them are there for reasons, as you said, about war trauma, but they come to it from really different kinds of war experiences. That a lot are refugees from Indochina, from the wars there that the U.S. had a great deal to do with, and others are white war veterans, and they bring all their prejudice against each other as well as other people there. So it's a contentious, complicated scene where different for both physical disabilities, like there are people, because of all the landmines that were used, there are people who are missing limbs and otherwise disabled. And then there's the kind of emotional trauma that people are coming with from their war experience. And so the forest was, in a way, a place for trying to find life despite all of those experiences. We're trying to find what they often called freedom, but in very different meanings of the term, in the forest, in the practice of picking mushrooms.
I found this concept of the forest really, and the edge of the forest and foraging, both foreign and familiar somehow. And also this, but I did respond to that idea of trauma, and I suppose that in looking at some of the weather report things that are going on with this, when people are going, boy, it's sure getting hot, you do feel trauma. I'm also thinking of, I think it's Freud's pleasure principle, maybe the book about pleasure principle, in which he says something like, it's jellyfish he's talking about, and he says jellyfish are reliving the trauma of photosynthesis. And I thought, whoa, there's a wild idea that we all have. They're thinking back to the first time, like photosynthesis, it was such a shock, like their birth trauma. so there's something very amazing about the stories that you're telling. Especially, I learned a lot of stuff from your book. Also, I didn't know that we were 90% bacteria. Is that true? Are we 90% bacteria? And what do they want? What are they doing? Where are we going because of that?
Well, I mean, you could say all multicellular life is a kind of playground for bacteria to get the things that they want. That all of us, from jellyfish to whatever, great trees and bears and lions, are playgrounds for bacteria, where the bacteria, if you want to see it that way, have managed to create these really fantastical forms of life that make better worlds for bacteria.
Yeah, I was also not so familiar with that idea that the DNA is part virus, and that always uh, uh, that kind of terrifies me. Are, are, are we mutating now, do you think, in some way?
Oh, always. The thing about I think we underappreciate the rapidity of the evolutionary process, and it's happening with all kinds of forms of life where uh, fish are evolving to be smaller because the only ones that get out of the nets are the small ones. So every kind of organism on Earth is evolving a lot to meet the demands of all these crazy things that humans are up to.
So will we be able to meet those demands as the world turns into ruins? It's you're so good at imagining worlds, and I think many people are trying to do that. Like, what is this thing becoming as it seems to be collapsing, and how are we going to be able to keep up with that, or are we just going to, like your description of capitalism flattening the landscapes and everyone, and as everything becomes privatized, that and it gets bound into this sort of political story as well. How do humans deal with that? I'm not asking you that as a question, because you asked that in so many ways in your book, that I found it that those kinds of stories are really new ones, because I think everyone's almost dead to the stories of climate is the climate story, and it's such a terrifying one that it's unhearable now. But I appreciate your bravery in being able to, like, go, okay, what is this, what is the story? And there's so many ones that are completely untold. And this, how do you deal with that kind of end of the world story in Feral Atlas? Are there ways that you look at that?
Sure. The whole project is devoted to how do we tell sometimes terrifying stories, but in ways that rather than causing paralysis and keeping people out, bring people in to, as what my colleague Donna Haraway calls staying with the trouble, that stories that grip us, that move us, that make us want to get involved in small ways or big ways. How do we tell those kinds of stories? I think it's a real challenge. And so Feral Atlas is a storytelling project in a way for how do we tell stories that are close to real things that, scholars might have done research on, that have experiences behind them, and hold people's attention even as they are often quite terrible and terrifying.
Yeah. I think, isn't the word wonder in the title of this conversation somehow? I was thinking of it. It was reminding me of one of my absolute favorite little paragraphs, and then I saw something in your book that seemed like a mirror of that. So I just wanted to read this thing, because it's kind of my mantra of big and how things. And you talk so beautifully in your book about progress and what it is and what it used to feel like, and then what it supposedly is now. It's just big, 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 and also. So anyway, this is George Trow, who wrote in the context of no context, and I'm just going to read this because it's so lovely. He writes, "Wonder was the grace of the country. Any action could be justified by that. The wonder it was rooted in. Period followed period, and finally the wonder was that things could be built so big. Bridges, skyscrapers, fortunes, all having a life first in the marketplace. still drew on the force of wonder. But then a moment's quiet. What was it now that was built so big? Only the marketplace itself. And could there be wonder in that? Could there be wonder in the size of the con? Now that one just chills my blood in ways that you absolutely totally do in your and I'm sorry to do this, but there's a couple of sentences that you had in your book that were also so beautiful, and they're part of my repertoire now of things that I love to read to inspire me. So you wrote, when economic growth slowed in the 1990s, neither education nor employment seemed so easier route to progress-based well-being. The economy of spectacles and desires flourished, but it became detached from life course expectations. It became harder to imagine where life should lead and what, besides commodities, should be in it. I mean, that's also like the kinds of questions that you ask in your book, which are, really why do we live? We're really so powerful, and also I love that you ended the book with the carrier bag theory of fiction. Ursula Le Guin is also one of my favorite books. And can you talk a little bit about that and what led you to end your book that way?
Sure. I mean, and the end of the book actually is about the kind of intellectual practice that scholars and others could be a part of, and that rather than the kind of heroic story that Ursula Le Guin identifies as the kind of man the hunter theory of fiction, she's worried about kind of novels where the plot has to be carried by the spearhead of the narrative itself breaking through. She argues that instead, like the gathering foraging practices that so much of human time on Earth has been preoccupied by, we're putting things together. We're telling stories by cobbling bits and pieces, by borrowing always from others, by repeating stories we've heard before in new ways, by taking little bits that nobody cared about but sticking them in, so that there's something very collaborative always in the process of storytelling, and that what we come up with is not necessarily a spearhead breaking through whatever's been there before, but a kind of collection, an assembly, a polyphony, back to the musical way of understanding it. And that I think that kind of storytelling, whether it's in the academy as scholars and scientists work together, or in the rest of the world where we're trying to struggle to tell stories that sustain us in difficult times, that we need those carrier bag kinds of stories.
Yeah, and I love that one line from that. It was like, it wasn't the meat that made the difference, it was the story. So that these guys went out and killed the woolly mammoth, and they came back with a story, really exciting, more exciting than you're just sorting through some like oats in your, to feed family. Oh, that's really interesting. So you're just going, really, do we have to have the clubbing on the head be the killer stories are going to be the stories that we really love. And if you look at stories that are around, those are the dominant stories, the like boom stories, the mushroom clouds, the ones that are, the stories about annihilation and terror and weapons and war stories, and so I'm just thinking of, I mean, of course, it's easy to say that it's maybe a different kind of story that men tell as opposed to women. Women have told a lot of good war stories, I have to say, but many of my favorite artists do tell stories in a different way. And I'm just thinking, for example, of Pauline Oliveros, who's a wonderful composer and does these works called deep listening, which are about kind of like drone-like things that are just beautiful and complex kinds of sounds. that are very kind of communal experiences. And a lot of people were recently introduced to her work and the work of many other electronic musicians who are women in a film called Sisters with Transistors that came out last year. And these are a series of stories about a scene of which I was part of in the 70s and 80s of women doing electronics and doing a lot of things, a lot of concerts with electronics and gear. Now, people are going, what? I didn't even know about that. And you're like, you don't know about that because that wasn't put into books, because it was about women goofing around, frankly. So I think some of these stories, especially the ones that don't feature the spears, and actually it's kind of weird because I'm sitting here in front of a bunch of spears. I have about 100 weapons and spears inherited from my husband, who is a martial artist. And so I use some of them. I like spears, like weapons, but one of the things about stories and music and language as a weapon is it's Pauline Oliveras' 90th birthday. If she were alive, it would be even more fun, but she's not. So we're celebrating her music and her ethos, her way of making music in a very communal way, in a way of really collective way, which for me is becoming more and more interesting, as opposed to like, here's my music, here's my latest record, to do this. And one of the things that we're trying to organize now is one of her deep listening events to celebrate some of the people who testified in the January 6th hearings. And these hearings were a lot of the testimony actually was given by young women and women in general. Many of the men in their 50s, 60s, 70s scampered off, citing executive privilege, and they just they really can't say what happened. They can't say it. So we're kind of trying to celebrate the women who did speak out were called mentally incompetent, and they began to get death threats for speaking. So what we're trying to do is in support of these people who spoke, principally women, to do a deep listening and in support of the hearings. So I think that many stories, as you point out in your book, have gotten lost because they're not part of the general storytelling narrative of our culture. And so I think one of the great things also about this global weather project is you're going to get a lot of different kinds of stories. And when Michael asked us to do this, and he said, well, what can artists and anthropologists do? I was like, oh, I don't know. But I think, you as someone who gathers stories from so many different points, and could show these stories in another context, not in necessarily an academic context or but perhaps maybe as just other ways to make things, because we're stuck in our very local little scene. And I'm speaking now as an artist in New York, where we have our little scene of like what art is, and we stay within those little boundaries and we sell stuff, and it's a very well developed market. But what do you think of this possibility of, is that just silly to think about
Art
stories?
and anthropology and stories. Well, I was also, when I knew we were going to be in dialogue, worrying about how did I see my own work in relation to art. And I thought of something that supposedly a person from Bali said to Margaret Mead, which was, we have no art, we only do everything as beautifully as possible.
That's so nice.
It's just a nice way. And I mean, I don't know if you know anything about Bali, but there really is a lot of ceremonial, beautiful performance and, you know, all kinds of arts as we might classify them, but seeing them as doing things as beautifully as possible is really helpful to me to think about the possible conversations between art and
Yeah.
anthropology that without, I mean, because an anthropologist, including me, does not know all those conventions and markets and things in New York that you're talking about, and yet perhaps has stories and possible ways of trying to do them that could form the basis of a dialogue.
Yeah. And I guess the thing that also kind of gives me pause in that too is like when we talk about nature now and weather, we're all so weirdly divorced from it in a certain way. You know, we're at the edge of the forest. We don't even go into the forest. We don't know where the forest is. Or for you know, for people like me who live in cities, to invoke, you know, nature, we're not really all that sure what that means anymore. I mean, there was that great, I don't know if you saw this, it was Komar and Melamed in early 90s. They were two Russian artists who decided, what do people think of nature and what do they think is beautiful? Let's do a survey. So they hired a bunch of one ad firm to find out what people all over the world thought was beautiful. And they then constructed what they call the Most Wanted series. So there's a Most Wanted painting in the United States, the Most Wanted painting in Russia, the Most Wanted painting in Finland. And they looked at all of those things. It was also, I think it was sponsored by the Dia Foundation and note Chase Manhattan Bank. Oh, note. Anyway, let's forget that a bank sponsored this, but they came up with this crazy series of things, and strangely enough, they looked what Americans liked in a painting. What everybody liked mostly was landscapes. We like landscapes. We like a blue sky. We like a cloud. We like some trees. And if you're French, you like a couple historical figures. Everybody likes a little deer in the background, a squirrel in the foreground, some flowers. That's beautiful. And they just decided, okay, let's not guess about what is beautiful. Let's find out. Let's take a survey. So I thought that was a really beautiful project, and it was just like, what do you think? Do you think there's like do you think there's agreement on artful ways and beautiful things?
What we tried to do in Feral Atlas is to collect up really divergent ways of telling stories about what's happening in our environments around us. And they really range. You know, we were so lucky as to get a Australian Aboriginal clansperson to do a painting from his kind of lineage arts of the effect of cane toads on his clan ancestor, which are these monitor lizards that are in fact disappearing because of the cane toads. And it's the painting itself, which comes from a tradition of the arts that's completely different than, you know, the New York art scene or something. And then he just tries to explain this painting and why the painting is in itself a kind of way of understanding landscape, but it doesn't have the squirrels and the trees in it at all, but has these clan figures and how community gets constituted. And we juxtapose, you know, that in the point in Feral Atlas is to have that, also to have a scientific report by a guy who looked into the drinking water in, you know, big cities, found all these little creatures swimming around in the drinking water that you did not know you were having as part of your cup of tea every day. And, you know, all these, because they use chlorine to kill the bacteria, but doesn't kill all these little animals that are swimming around. And so so we have very, very varied kinds of stories and storytelling. And that's kind of the point, is that if we're going to imagine a planetary kind of condition, it's got to be one with so much heterogeneity in it that these patches, including the patches of storytelling, are are going to be quite different. And indeed, in some cases, we purposely had, two reports on the same thing. That maybe you've heard of kudzu, the vine that
Yeah.
smothers so much in the U.S. Southeast, and it just grows over everything. And um, uh, so a Swedish artist came and did a series of photographs of kudzu, and they're very haunting and spooky looking. And then some scientists wrote about why is kudzu so successful in these abandoned cotton plantations that support this life and allow it to spread out in other places. And so by having these different kinds of storytelling practices, we were hoping to create a kind of Anthropocene, a planetary condition that's not just one thing, not one kind of global circulation of air and water, which is important too, but a bunch of heterogeneous patches that are incommensurable and yet speak to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I saw like in what you just said, and also your book of creating a different sort of ways of seeing nature and beauty in this kind of like, as you say, ruin. And I'm just thinking of some Buddhist teachers I know who are kind of like, they were teaching some kids who, some like, what we used to call super underprivileged children, but children who had nothing. And these Buddhist teachers were trying to say, invoke nature as a way for them to find a certain kind of calmness. And then realized that they had no idea what nature is. Nothing. It would be a crack in some grass growing up out of a sidewalk, or it would be some mold in the cans on the street. But this other idea of finding something in human nature that you point out that is could be give us some encouragement is just look at more intently at yourself, who is this collection of bacteria and virus, and also not to look at it with horror, but with interest and with wonder, fascination. But I think that a lot of people are kind of afraid of that, not kind of afraid, really afraid. And for them, I think like mushrooms have a bad rep, in the general. I grew up where one of the theme songs that was really scary was I don't know if you know the song. There was a fungus among us. It was a pretty popular song in 1958. I think somebody, what was his name? Nolan is his last name. Nolan wrote this song. There was a fungus among us, and there was a rumble in the jungle is the second line. So I think that was Muhammad Ali, maybe rumble in the jungle. Maybe they got it from a song. Anyway, the third line is there's static in the attic, a moaning and a groaning. There's a fungus among us, and the chorus is, which one is the fungus? Which one is the fungus? There was a fungus among us, and which one of you is the fungus? And so it was like, it was considered like a way to, but I also wanted to, because you wrote something very beautiful about the we of storytelling, and this we of terrified people dancing in their attic, and there's fungus among us are a group that you were defining in your book early on as American Protestants, who were the we that became the we in the Constitution, we white people. So in a way, and I thought that that really rang a lot of bells, and there was not the freedom bell that it was ringing out. But can you talk a little bit about that we that you were talking about? Because now in the United States and in many other places, that we is us versus them. It's not a we that we refer to anymore. We don't know what we is, aside from the fact that some of us are they and some of us are thems. And so can you talk about how you developed that idea and what that means in terms of telling a story, because it's harder when it's a we.
So you mean the powerful, I'm a little bit confused about what you want me to address.
Well, I guess you were saying that it came from this Protestant revivalism that
Mm-hmm.
was around since the American Revolution, and then became the we in the Constitution, and that this we um, became kind of like ossified. I don't know if you said that, but I kind of heard it that way, of
Yeah.
this way of saying we, and then how that we is used politically. I'm thinking also of like a guy like Karl Rove, who says, whoever tells the story is the one who has the power. And you're like, oh, that's right on, who gets to say that. So I just really appreciated your story of how that developed out of a certain kind of Protestant. Is that how it
Yeah,
was?
no, I think that is true, and that as the U.S. has gotten so incredibly polarized, that part of the problem is, yes, a group of people who feel like they controlled that we,
Yeah,
and that maybe they don't anymore, and haven't been able to get much joy out of this new sense of a different kind of we that's been forming, been emerging for a long time now, and feel instead really threatened by the loss of that kind of powerful we that
sure. Yeah,
got to control the story.
yeah. It's true. While you're saying that, I realized that you're all about we, the polyphony of all of these stories kind of coming together. So that's a whole different idea. I know we're running out of time suddenly, and I just wanted to say one thing that's I have I planted some pine trees at my house, and they're all dying, and we don't know why. So we have to dig them up again. And I was getting really depressed about that. And then as I was reading your book, I was like, don't get depressed about that. You're not making a lawn, you're trying to see what's wrong with these trees and then help them. And they're all like losing their needles. I'm like, why I think we planted them, or, we planted them 3 years ago, or just at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought we were doing it right. And, your beautiful descriptions of how you learn about ruins gave me a different perspective on my dying trees. And also, a different thing about feeling about what it means to have needles fall and create a bit of a mess, and how beautiful that is, and how I don't want to live on a golf course in my yard of swept things. So I just want to thank you for that part of and the many other things that you said in your book, which are just so. I mean, I hope people get a chance to. Well, when did this come out? It came out a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's such an important book, and such a joyride to read. It's the kind of book you're like, whoa, So also, I mean, there are a million other things that I wanted to ask you about with that, especially in terms of nature and economy, and how the scariest thing for me in your book was, how do you pronounce the Klamath?
Mm-hmm.
Is it Klamath?
Mm-hmm.
And that you were
Yes.
saying there are some Native Americans in Oregon, is it, or
Yes.
Northwest, who were being kind of typically raided by the loggers and taking their land, and then they took some of it back, and then there was back and forth. And then you mentioned this one thing, which was some of the attorneys who are representing them, these Native Americans, were borrowing from them to basically take their land. And I was like, what?
Right,
Is
I
that
mean, it's a big important story about how the Klamath and some other groups were detribalized in order to steal their land.
Yeah.
That they were given the honor of not having federal recognition anymore, precisely because they were wealthy and they had a resource that others, particularly timber companies, wanted. And so they lost their the rights that they had as Native peoples, and in the process, yes, not only lost their rights but lost their resources. And now there's a big struggle going on to try and reclaim some of that.
Amazing story, and also the engine of your book in many ways, which it made me think of Moby Dick in different ways. You know, like that. What are they out there doing? This, I think you called it rowdy cosmopolitans or something like that. It was a great description of the team.
Rereading Moby Dick, there's many ways to read that book, but seeing it as a kind of weird commodity chain from that period. I mean, it's really an extraordinary account of a commodity chain in which so many different kinds of people were involved in hunting whales.
And hunting, but also the straight up sort of robbery stories that you were telling me, which is the story of capitalism, like that's mine. And I was telling a friend about this thing, and I said, these attorneys borrowed from the Klamath money so that they could get their land. I said, and he said, oh yeah, that's called leveraging. I was like, what? I mean, I like your shirt. But I don't have any money. I'm a little short. So I like your shirt. Can you loan me the money so I can buy your shirt and own it? And I was like, is that, and that's the way a lot of this world works. So when you have an engine like that, it's just gimme, 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 gimme. It's impossible to change the basic thing unless you suddenly have a whole bunch of people who have a totally different attitude towards life. In other words, let's call them for a second, Buddhists who might want to say, how about empathy as a basic premise? And so much of your book is like, how about empathy? so I on many levels, that one gave me pause. I mean, I
hope you can get the pine trees to grow again, or different ones, because I mean it's related to the empathy thing, because it really is true. I mean, the pines is a very generous tree that grows well with other things, especially lots of kinds of mushrooms, and that sense of our kinship with all the different things around us. Pine are good at sort of teaching us how to imagine and enact living with others.
On that note, I'd like to thank you both for the stories you've told today and for sharing your experience in such an open-hearted way and getting to know each other. Laurie, you pointed out you'd never met, but you wouldn't know that now because you have met. And I really want to thank you so much for being with us today and sharing what you shared. It was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for putting us together and bringing us into the World Weather Network.
Yeah.